At the end of the third essay of the Genealogy, Nietzsche turns his attention to whether or not anything in contemporary culture opposes slave morality. And so the idea here is he's trying to find whether there's anything within contemporary culture that offers hope. Because, of course, according to Nietzsche, slave morality is life denying and it's collapsing. But what he's hopeful for, what he's looking for, is a new value system of a kind of new nobility, a new noble morality that would replace slave morality as slave morality is collapsing. And so what he does here at the end of the third essay is he kind of canvasses culture, trying to see whether or not there is something within it that we can kind of latch onto that might contain the seeds of this new nobility. And to give away the end already, in Nietzsche's view, there is not. There is nothing within our culture that actually opposes slave morality or ascetic ideals. Let's see why he thinks this. Nietzsche considers three possibilities. There are three contenders for three things that might, you might think oppose ascetic ideals: science, atheism, and modern philosophy. You might think those things oppose ascetic ideals, oppose slave morality. And then Nietzsche is going to proceed through them one by one, arguing that they don't. So let's see how those arguments work. So let's first consider science. So you might think that science opposes ascetic ideals. And you might, that might seem a weird way of putting it, I suppose, or not, at the very least, not an intuitive way of putting the point. But what Nietzsche has in mind here is something like what we today hear about as the conflict between science and religion, right? This is like a trope of whatever modern discourse about science and religion, that these two things conflict, right? Science and religion, ascetic ideals, right? That's kind of associated with religion in certain ways, it seems. And so you might think that science opposes ascetic ideals, right? Because science isn't religious at all, or something like that, right? That might be the idea that at least some people today seem to have. Nietzsche disagrees. He doesn't think that there's fundamentally a conflict between science and religion. The reason he gives for well, whatever. The reason he gives for there not being a conflict, however, is it's not what you might expect, I suppose. According to Nietzsche, science today is either one of two things. And the first one is the one that really concerns us. It's what is science today? In all likelihood, it's probably just the most recent form of the ascetic ideal. It doesn't stand in opposition to it. It's just the most recent form of it. That's the first thing. We'll return to it in just a second, talk about it more in just a second. Science is either that, or, to put it in Nietzsche's words, it's simply a refuge for people who refuse to wake up and face the problem of making sense of humanity. We'll talk about these both in just a second, but what is the argument? Well, either way, whichever science is, whichever of those two things it is, it doesn't oppose ascetic ideals. And so it's not anything that we can latch on to for opposing ascetic ideals. So return to the first one, the most recent form of the ascetic ideal. Nietzsche's idea here is that what's animating science is placing this unconditional value on truth. Science is motivated by truth, and not just, it's motivated by truth at all costs. It's motivated by an unconditional value placed on truth. Truth is the most valuable thing. Truth at all costs. Now, you might think that, yeah, sure, fine, science is like that. It's all about truth. It's all about figuring out the truth, come what may, right? Well, we're going to figure out how the world works, investigate it using experiments and so on. And we're not going to care about whether or not it's convenient or what. No, we're just going to find the truth. And so you might think, yeah, sure, fine, that makes sense of science, truth at all costs. But the ascetic ideal? I mean, how is the ascetic ideal related to this? And we're going to go on this idea here that the ascetic ideal is related to the will to truth in some way is going to be central to all of Nietzsche's arguments in this section. So what is the ideal? Or what is the idea, I should say? What is Nietzsche's idea here? The heart of ascetic ideals, according to Nietzsche, is the unconditional value of truth. At the heart of ascetic ideals is the unconditional value of truth. At the heart of slave morality is the unconditional value of truth. And so, insofar as science is simply a further manifestation of that, it is simply a further manifestation of ascetic ideals of slave morality. Science as we know it today, according to Nietzsche, springs from slave morality. Why is the unconditional value of truth the heart of ascetic ideals and slave morality? Where is that coming from? Couple things to say. First one, a little bit easier than the second one, but the second one will maybe understand a bit better given what we've covered this semester. First one, why think that ascetic ideals are committed to this idea of the unconditional value of truth? Well, look at these religious traditions. So in particular, what I'm going to focus on is not Judaism, Christianity, because that's kind of what Nietzsche is really focusing on. Jesus, who according to Christians is God, comes down to earth and says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. What is Nietzsche going to pick up on that? I am the truth. Jesus is the truth. God is the truth. That idea, God is the truth. And right, that's not specific to Christianity. You find that in the other Abrahamic religions as well. That idea, God is the truth. That's where the idea that truth has an unconditional value comes from. That's what justifies that idea. Truth can only have an unconditional value if the truth is seen as divine. Thinking of the truth as divine is what justifies truth at all costs. It's what motivates and justifies pursuing the truth at all costs, right? And we find that identification, that idea within your major religions, within Christianity. God is identified with truth. And of course, God is unconditionally valuable as well. Of course, God is the best thing, the greatest good. And so insofar as truth becomes identified with God, and God is the greatest good, well, then truth becomes the greatest good. That is to say, truth becomes unconditionally valuable. And so that's where this ideal of the truth at all costs, the unconditional value of truth, comes from. It comes from these religious traditions, but not just these religious traditions. according to Nietzsche. And this is the second way we can make sense of this idea, which is more sophisticated, but we're now in a position to see, having taken this class. What Nietzsche's also picking up on here is Plato and Aristotle and the philosophic tradition. Plato, or Nietzsche, I should say, doesn't see a big division between Plato and Aristotle on the one hand, and then say Christianity or Islam or Judaism on the other, between these religious traditions and these philosophic traditions. At one point, not in anything we read, but somewhere else, Nietzsche says that Christianity is simply Platonism for the masses. It's the same value system. Plato and Aristotle are expressions of slave morality, just as Christianity and Judaism and Islam are. And what you find in Plato and Aristotle is this unconditional value of truth. You find Plato in the image of the cave saying the mark of education, the mark of happiness, is devotion to the truth. Is your soul turned toward the truth, or is it turned toward falsity? That is the mark of whether or not you are living well. And our job as human beings is to turn our souls toward the truth, because the truth is the best thing there is. The fundamental truth of all things is the form of the good. And these forms are divine, right? And so you find this unconditional value of truth in Plato. You find it in Aristotle, the highest truth about all things, right? What is that? Well, that would just be the actualization of all the forms of all things. That's just God. That's the unmoved mover in Aristotle, right? And the unmoved mover, the highest truth of frogs and trees and everything else, the unmoved mover is also the final cause of all things. It's the good of all things. And so the highest truth of all things is the good of all things. Truth is unconditionally valuable. It's the greatest good. You find that idea in Aristotle, right? And so what Nietzsche is actually picking up on here, and I think this is rather perceptive, what is at the root of Plato, Aristotle, Christianity, the Abrahamic religions more generally, what is fundamental and foundational to these worldviews, what is at their heart, is the unconditional value of truth. And so in Nietzsche's view, Plato, Aristotle, Christianity, Islam, these are all fundamentally similar worldviews. They are all, in some sense, harmonious. They all have a similar fundamental structure. And whatever disagreements you find among them are, in Nietzsche's view, peripheral. And so science, insofar as it's an expression of this idea of putting a unconditional value on truth at all costs, it's simply the most recent expression of the ascetic ideals. It doesn't stand in opposition to them, right? That's one thing science might be. And if that's what it is, well, then clearly it doesn't oppose ascetic ideals, right? One last thing I want to say about this. Well, how is this life denying? One thing that Nietzsche indicates is that by placing this kind of value on truth, we denigrate and deny life. We affirm this other world. We affirm this land of forms from Plato, or this unmoved mover, or this divine reality. We say yes to that, but in so doing, we say no to this reality down here. We deny this reality, and this reality is where our lives are. This is the reality, this reality is where our instincts and power and strength and so on are. And so by affirming this other world, this world of truth that's supernatural, so to speak, or something like that, by affirming the fundamental value, unconditional value of truth, we deny this world, right? Something like that is something Nietzsche indicates. So that's one thing science might be. The second thing it might be is a refuge for people who refuse to wake up and face the problem, making sense of humanity. What he has in mind here, much less interesting. But for all that, it might be under the truth. What Nietzsche is talking about here is simply like, look, a lot of scientists are not interested in these big fundamental questions. They just want to go into their lab and look at, and fire electrons at protons and then measure, how many whatever, positrons fly off, and that's it. They don't have any sense of the big picture. They're not concerned with the big picture. They just want to tabulate their data and, find whatever regularities they can find, and that's it. Well, those are people who are not, so as Nietzsche puts it, they refuse to wake up and face the problem and make sense of humanity. Okay, fine. That's a pretty, that's kind of an indictment. But you might also just think of it in terms of like, they're just not interested in these big questions. They're not interested in using science to address the kind of fundamental questions that human beings might have about the natural world, and in particular, humans' place in it. They're not concerned with these big questions. They're concerned with, what is the rate of proton decay and blah, 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 blah. And that's it. Well, if that's all they're concerned with, they're not going to be opposing ascetic ideals because they're not really putting forward any kind of ideal. They're not opposing or really being in favor of anything. They're just interested in tabulating data or whatever, right? And so that's not going to stand in opposition to ascetic ideals either. Well, okay, fine. So science doesn't stand in opposition to ascetic ideals, to slave morality, because science, insofar as it puts forward any kind of ideal, is still just committed to the fundamental ideal of ascetic ideals of slave morality. Well, fine then. How about atheism? Atheism's got to stand in contrast to ascetic ideals. After all, the whole explanation I just gave for why science didn't was because science is committed to this value of truth, and this value of truth is ultimately justified by reference to God and so on. And so maybe atheism, right? Atheism's got it, and more intuitively, kind of more zoomed out. If ascetic ideals are kind of identified with the religion, and maybe also then Plato and Aristotle, well, look, all those people thought God existed and thought there was this divine realm and so on. And so maybe atheism then would stand in opposition to ascetic ideals. Nietzsche, no. Atheism doesn't stand in contrast to ascetic ideals because atheists, like the scientists we were just considering, accept the unconditional value of truth. They unconditionally accept this is the way Nietzsche sometimes puts it. They unconditionally accept the will to truth at all costs. What animates atheists, the reason they are atheists, is because it's the truth in their view, right? And, it doesn't take too long. You can browse around on the internet and find all these kind of, atheist internet forums or whatever. And they tend to make a big deal about how they're super rational. And so, right, the rational community, we're trying to be rational. Like this is a kind of, they make a big deal out of this. Well, this would just be grist for Nietzsche's mill. You just want to say, yeah, you're all concerned about truth. And so if you're all concerned about truth, you are still kind of paradoxically enough, or ironically enough, you are still motivated by these ideals that are kind of, in some fundamental sense, religious. You are still fundamentally motivated by this unconditional value of truth. And Nietzsche's idea here seems to be that atheists are kind of unaware of themselves. Why place an unconditional value on truth? Why truth at all costs? Nietzsche's idea is that the only possible justification for that view, for that idea, is because truth is divine. Atheists, of course, don't want to say that. But then atheists not saying that don't have any good reason for placing an unconditional value on truth. That's Nietzsche's view, at least. And so there's a kind of tension within atheism, right? The thing that motivates it, they're in some sense, the thing that motivates it can't be justified by it, right? Because what motivates atheism, according to Nietzsche, is placing a metaphysical value, a value in itself, an unconditional value on truth. And the only thing that justifies doing that is thinking of the truth as divine. But atheism can't do that. And so atheism can't, in fact, kind of support itself, according to Nietzsche. Nietzsche himself is an atheist. What he has in mind here, though, are these particular kinds of atheists who are atheists because the truth demands it, because they're rational, because they're into science, right? And this is the truth of things. It's those kinds of atheists, Nietzsche wants to say, that can't really make sense of their own ideals, and so can't really stand outside and oppose the ascetic ideal. As Nietzsche puts the point, placing an unconditional value on the will to truth expresses asceticism just as much as any negation of sensuality, just as much as, being celibate or chaste, right? Just as much as abiding by these sexual teachings of the various various religions and so on. The last thing Nietzsche considers is modern philosophy. And our representative of modern philosophy was Descartes. We read Descartes, we saw him, right? And you might think, just from the little bit that we read about Descartes, yeah, maybe Descartes then stands in opposition to this stuff. After all, he and his kind of fellow philosophers and scientists radically rejected this Aristotelian paradigm. And as I've been discussing, that Aristotelian paradigm, that Platonic Aristotelian paradigm, that was taken up by and incorporated into the Jewish faith, the Christian faith, the Muslim faith. And so, look, maybe Descartes and his fellow travelers, other modern philosophers, other, people like Galileo and so on, maybe they stand in opposition to the ascetic ideal because they rejected that worldview. And so maybe modern philosophy does. And Nietzsche, as you already know, is going to say no. And he's going to give similar kinds of reasons, as we've already seen, because modern philosophy places an unconditional value on truth, right? That's going to be the heart of the reason. But he says something further that is very interesting. He says, look, it would be naive to think that the downfall of theological astronomy indicates a downfall of that ideal. What he is picking out here, what he is aware of, is the historical record. We talked about this. Why did people like Descartes reject this Aristotelian paradigm? Well, because they observed the solar system more accurately than human beings had been able to previously. And they saw what those observations helped reveal was that geocentrism is false. And, that heliocentrism was true. And the kind of more fundamental point that revealed was that this more general view of the solar system was false. This Aristotelian view of the solar system, according to which the gods, the unmoved mover, played a role in the orbits and the rotation of the stars and planets. That was the view from Aristotle. That was the view that implied geocentrism, and that's the view that was overturned with the scientific revolution. And so when Nietzsche talks about the downfall of theological astronomy, what he has in mind is the downfall of this Aristotelian paradigm of the solar system. And yeah, that happens with the scientific revolution. That's what happens. But what he's saying is it's naive to think that that indicates a downfall of the ideal. Just because you reject that facet of things, that doesn't mean you reject all of the values that originated in Aristotelianism, Platonism, Christianity, Islam, Judaism. No. And so what do you would particularly have in mind here, right? Clearly, modern philosophy is still dedicated to truth, to the unconditional value of truth. To bring in, and then, right? And so modern philosophy, atheism, science do not actually give us any escape from this fundamentally Judeo-Christian way of finding meaning in and making sense of the world. They're just the latest expressions of that. Nietzsche's view is that we need to escape this. Now, one last point that I want to make to try to bring together some of what we've seen from Nietzsche now. We started off the genealogy looking at morality. And here at the end of moral values, what we would call morality, don't lie to people, don't murder, don't cheat, don't steal, and blah, blah, blah. And then we end the genealogy with Nietzsche identifying the will to truth as the fundamental value of slave morality, of what we would call morality. Nietzsche's view is that everything that we call morality today is built upon this unconditional value of truth, is part of slave morality. And this is what we need to escape. A further proof that science, atheism, modern philosophy don't oppose the ascetic ideal, don't oppose slave morality, is that if you look at the morality of scientists, atheists, and modern philosophers, it's just the same stuff that you saw Aristotle and Plato doing, saying, yeah, don't lie, don't cheat, don't murder, don't steal, don't blah, 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 right? The moral content is the same. Their morality is the same. They have all the same moral values. And so, of course, these things don't stand in opposition, right? Who stands in opposition? Somebody like Callicles stands in opposition to this moral system, not somebody who's talking about fairness, right? One last thing. We've talked about this briefly. One last way to make sense of this. Think of something like a moral egalitarianism, the idea that all people are equal. We think that this is just obvious. How could somebody possibly deny this? You would have to be a monster if you thought some people were better than other people or deserved more than other people or whatever it might be. Right? For us, this is obvious. And for modern atheists, this is obvious. For modern scientists, this is obvious. For modern philosophers, this is obvious. For everybody today, this is obvious. Of course, everybody is fundamentally equal. Why think that? Why think that we are all equally valuable? Nietzsche is pointing out that absent slave morality, or he is claiming, put it this way, he is claiming that absent slave morality, there's no good sense to be made of that idea. The only reason to think that we are all fundamentally equal is given to us by slave morality. Because think about it. I'm taller than you. You are funnier than me. She is whatever, a better writer than him. And anything that you like, anything that you'd want to compare people on, they're different. In what sense is everybody equal? Why should we treat everybody equally if we're all so different? Why should we think that everybody has some sort of equal moral standing? This is actually a pretty significant problem within modern philosophical ethics. What people have tried to, modern philosophers have tried to give justifications for more modern egalitarianism, and some of them think that they have and that they've successfully done so. But the justifications, as other people have pointed out, are amazingly, shockingly weak. They don't really seem to hold much water, right? If you want to say, oh, well, because we all have reason. Well, why does that make us all equal? Some people are more rational than others. Aren't those more rational people then worth more than the less rational people? If reason is what makes us great. Oh, yeah, okay. Nietzsche's idea is that egalitarianism springs from slave morality. How is it justified? We're all equal before God. Before God, all human beings are equal. Right? That's what Nietzsche suggests in certain places. And so egalitarianism is this relic of slave morality that continues to live to today. It's one of these shadows on the wall of the cave. That's Nietzsche's idea, right? And so insofar as we don't oppose egalitarianism, moral egalitarianism, this idea that we're all equal, we don't oppose ascetic ideals. That's Nietzsche's idea. We're going to return to this idea in the next video.